Okay, Rachel, first question. Your thoughts that the verdict came back so quickly?
I I was thrilled for Brandon. I was thrilled for Maricopa County that their hard work, their effort, their decision to go forward led to such quick results for and justice for Brandon. He deserved his day in court, and I'm really glad the jury saw the truth of what he was saying.
I know you and I had talked before the trial that this maybe could have been the hardest case to prove because, you have a living victim who's alive. He wasn't killed, and just because of a variety of different factors. So, as the prosecution laid out their case, what did you think of it?
I still think it was one of the hardest cases the state had. It was pure circumstantial. You had a victim who survived, who couldn't ID their shooter, who couldn't even definitively say, how many shots had been fired. And much like with Tammy's case, he initially worried it was a paintball gun, right? And those sort of things jurors can latch onto. But I'm really grateful that the jury they listened all along. They saw the clarity of what happened, and the state's story showed them the truth. I think they were really paying attention because they didn't even ask questions most of the time. So
Right.
that shows sort of the clarity of they weren't confused at any part of it, which is huge.
Trina, at one point, when Lori, they kept saying she was opening the door, and the judge sent the jury out. She flat out said, "We weren't planning to introduce the light and the dark stuff. We weren't planning to introduce religious or the cult or even the financial motives." But Lori kind of went down that route. Why wouldn't you bring that stuff in? I mean, that was pretty strong evidence. We heard about it in your cases in Idaho. We heard about it in Charles's, but nothing at all here.
When you have a case that you think is clean enough, straight enough, and the evidence is clear enough, you take the extraneous details out. So, when you have something where you believe in the strength of the evidence you have, you kind of stick with your core. The more you inject, the more chance there is for confusion, and a confused jury makes mistakes. And so the last thing you want is what I call a wrongful acquittal when you've overthought your case. So in this instance, the prosecution believed very strongly that the evidence they had in Brandon, who is an amazing witness, and that the evidence that they had to show Lori's participation and contribution to the conspiracy was strong enough without all the other stuff. You got to remember they had one victim, one day in question. They had a pretty tight nucleus. And if you believed Lori helping move the tire, Lori renting the equipment, renting the storage unit, Lori doing the Google search, the geolocation data for Alex, if you believe that is strong enough of and in itself to convict of conspiracy, then you don't add things that can confuse a jury. That case with Brandon is really different than what we had in Idaho. We had multiple victims over a span of months. And so for the case in Idaho with multiple victims involving the defendant's own children, you really have to show the motive, intent, and that overarching conspiracy. So there were really different cases, and the one with Brandon is much tighter, much more nuclear, and can be tried more simply.
Trina K must have followed your advice by putting Brandon on the stand first. You remember we talked about that. You said if it was your case, you'd put him on first, and that's what she did. Started with
Yeah.
him, ended with Hermosillo and Nick Ballens, who have strong evidence. What did you
Yeah.
think of Lori's cross of Brandon?
I think Lori once again is her own worst enemy. Uh, Brandon, Brandon is a very strong man of integrity who was devastated, not just by his divorce, because he's clearly a devout man of faith who believes in family and believes in living by a certain standard, right? He's not perfect, none of us are, but holds these things deeply. And when you talk to him, that shows. I think Lori's filter doesn't let her see people the way others do. And I think she just failed to connect the dots that the jury believed this man, that he was telling the truth, and that the trauma he suffered, not just in his divorce, but in the destruction of his family, in the murder of somebody who he cared about, Charles Vallow, in the murder of two children that he knew, that played with his kids, that babysat his kids, that lends itself to somebody who's going to speak with authenticity, compassion, and integrity. She grossly underestimated him, and her cross showed that. And the more she tried to attack Brandon Boudreaux, the bigger hole she dealt. I think her treatment of Brandon showed her motives, showed her depth of sort of disdain for him. And I think after Brandon's testimony, candidly, I think the jury, it was done.
Yeah, it
She's
seemed
no worst enemy.
a lot of people seemed to comment that she kind of ran out of gas as the trial went on. Just it just kind of unraveled. Um, what can you say about the appeal in Idaho? Have you had a chance to read it?
Yes, I have. Those are issues we expected to see. That the defense has got to come up with something. I think for Lori's point of view, her desire to have the counsel of her own choice is a legitimate issue to raise. It is not well founded. Judge Boyce, in my opinion, made an excellent record. The state had filed a couple of motions with regard to the conduct and our concerns with the conduct of her previous defense counsel, because we were concerned about a couple of different issues, conflict and potentially ineffective. Those are very unusual motions to file on behalf of the state. It's not something we take lightly. We didn't even ask the court to technically remove him. We asked the court to do an inquiry. And Judge Boyce did an inquiry and did it over a period of time. So there was lots of factors, some of which are public, some of which are not, that the court considered in making the final ruling. And some of the final ruling was not included in the appeal. So I'll be very interested to see the state's response, because a lot of the final reasons that Judge Boyce removed her counsel aren't actually in the pleadings.
Mm.
So that is my long-winded. I think if the record is really clear about why Judge Boyce did what he did, how long it took him to do it, and how much evidence he reviewed, that issue will be really well settled. The other issue is the prior 404B acts, that sort of evidence that, hey, the prior stuff somebody did is relevant to show that they did it this time,
Hmm.
or that helps give them a motive or intent, or that their conduct wasn't a mistake in a current charge. That, again, was a hearing that was held outside the presence of the jury. It was well briefed. It was handled by Lindsay Blake. She did a thorough job in making a record. She put on appropriate evidence. The defense got a chance to cross-examine, and Judge Boyce took his time and made a written ruling that was well based on the record. I think in order for the Idaho Supreme Court to say, hey, it wasn't right, they're going to have to want to change Idaho law. And I don't think they're going to want to do that, and certainly not in this particular case.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about Arizona this past trial is several references to Melanie
Yeah.
Palski. Trina Kay said she's under investigation. She is a co-conspirator. Stuff we had not heard publicly before. Everybody wants to know what does that mean?
Well, Trina Kay was being very honest with the court and the defendant that technically, as long as the statute of limitations, the time you have to bring the charges, hasn't expired, an investigation or charges could come. For the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in Arizona, that statute of limitations is unending. It goes on for life. So in theory, if new evidence comes forward, Melanie Boudreaux Pulowski could be charged 20 years from now. So Trina was being honest with the court and explaining, like, it's still open. Candidly, it's always going to be open. But realistically, I have never seen a person in a conspiracy charged years later. It's just, it would be highly, highly unusual for charges to come down at this time against a member of a conspiracy when the principal has already been charged.
Meaning Lori.
Lori, Lori, yeah, Lori Vallow, Chad, Alex, who can't be charged, were the principals. Melanie Boudreaux was the motive, and that we put that forward in Idaho. She is probably one of the reasons Brandon was targeted, but she is not. It is very unlikely that she would be charged at this date and time. And so I think the prosecutor was being candid with the court, was letting the defendant know, hey, look, it's still possible. What that does for the court is let the court know that if the defendant tries to bring in Melanie Palski or Boudreaux, or if somebody else, were to try to bring her in, Melanie Boudreaux has rights. The state couldn't bring Melanie Boudreaux in the court as a witness without cutting her a deal or
Mm,
giving her, by that I mean giving her immunity. So
mhm.
Melanie couldn't be a witness for the state once they're identified as the target of investigation and charges without a deal, immunity. Lori couldn't bring her in because Melanie Boudreaux would have the right and would be advised by counsel to take the fifth. And so Trina was letting the court and the defendant know, hey, we can't bring her in without prejudicing the proceedings and or Melanie's rights. So what she said was lawyer speak for why Melanie couldn't come in. It is in theory possible Melanie Pulowski could be charged. Realistically, I have never seen it in a case involving co-conspirators that the principals are indicted and then 4 or 5 years later, other members of the conspiracy are indicted. Never seen it.
Right. So it could have been if the other members had been indicted first, the principal could get indicted down the line. But to
Yes.
go after the lesser players, it might
Yeah.
be unusual. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting. Okay. Anything you want to add, Rachel?
No, I'm very pleased for Brandon because he's deserved this case in many respects began with him and his work with Kay. He's the one who first, in my opinion, connected the dots between Tammy and him and Charles. And he and Kay really worked with law enforcement to get them to help them see it in context. So there's so many people who were really good heroes in this situation, that there were good people who stood up, and Brandon's certainly one of them.
Well, thank you for all of your insight over the past few trials. And unfortunately, there's always crime.
Yeah, yeah.
Fortunately, that means we get to call on you. So we,
I
we
know. Thanks.
will continue to call on you, especially, maybe in a few weeks when the Koberger thing gets going.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to, because I really, one a frustrating thing to prosecutors and some law enforcement is when misinformation gets out there. And a few years ago, I realized the fault lies with the prosecutors because we don't talk. When there's misinformation out there, it's because the people who know the system from the prosecution side don't talk. And really, if we're not willing to talk when we can, then we can't get frustrated if we don't like the way things are done.